The last sword ever formally issued to soldiers was not some ancient masterpiece. It was assembled by a committee, tested against complaints from a war fought a decade earlier, and finished into the most technically optimized sword design in history. It was retired within 20 years, and it was never once used the way its designers intended. That committee did not exist to preserve tradition. It existed because British cavalry officers came home from the Boer War with a list of complaints about their swords. Blades that bent, blades that missed, blades that simply did not do what a sword in a cavalry charge needed to do. The Army's answer was not another compromise pattern. It was a full redesign from a blank sheet, built to end more than a century of argument in a single stroke. That argument had been running for more than a century before the committee ever sat down. British cavalry doctrine under John Gaspard Lemarchand favored the cut in the Napoleonic era, producing the dramatically curved 1796 light cavalry saber built purely for slashing. The 1822 patterns that followed tried to average the two approaches into one blade, slightly curved, theoretically stiff enough to thrust, adequate at neither. Every redesign after that repeated the same compromise under a new pattern number. Nobody had the nerve to just pick a side. Here is the detail that gets lost in the mythology around swords. Every cavalry sword before 1908 tried to do two jobs at once, cut and thrust, and every one of them was worse at both because of it. The 1908 pattern gave up on that compromise entirely. The blade carried a thick, T-shaped spine purely to resist bending on the thrust, a spear point ground for penetration, and a grip shaped like a pistol so the arm, wrist, and blade all pointed the same direction the instant it was extended. Cutting was barely an afterthought. The last 18 inches were technically sharpened and nothing more. When the design reached King Edward VII for formal approval, his first reaction was not admiration. He reportedly called it ugly, and had to be talked into approving a sword that looked nothing like the elegant curved blades cavalry officers had carried for a century. He signed off anyway, because the committee had already proven the design worked exactly as intended. The finished blade ran just over 35 inches, long enough that a fully extended arm holding it could match the reach of a cavalry lance or an infantry bayonet. Every measurement on that sword existed to serve one motion, a full extension thrust delivered at a gallop. Nothing about the geometry was left over for anything else. There was one flaw nobody fully solved. A thrust delivered with the combined force of a charging horse and rider could drive that spear point through a body up to the hilt. As the horse carried the rider past the target, the blade often would not pull free in time. The sword that was built purely to kill efficiently could disarm, unhorse, or break the wrist of the man holding it, purely because it worked too well. The same story played out almost identically on the other side of the Atlantic, 5 years later, with an American officer who happened to be an Olympic fencer. George S. Patton designed the Model 1913 cavalry saber after training with French instructors who had spent decades refining the pure thrust as doctrine. His saber dropped the curve entirely, a straight double-edged blade, an oversized basket hilt to protect the hand, built for one motion executed from horseback at speed. Officially, it replaced a design lineage that traced back to 1860. Unofficially, it closed the same debate the British had just settled, cut versus point, permanently, in favor of the point. The American lineage followed the identical pattern. The Model 1860, light cavalry saber, and its direct descendant, the Model 1906, were both curved, cut-capable blades with compromises baked in for a thrust they were never optimized to do well. Patton did not tweak that lineage. He broke it, the same way the British committee had broken theirs 5 years earlier, arriving independently at the identical conclusion: straight blade, protected hand, one job only. Patton's own credentials mattered here. He competed in the modern pentathlon at the 1912 Stockholm Olympics, an event that includes fencing, and he studied under French swordsmanship instructors specifically to refine his understanding of the thrust. He was not a bureaucrat rubber stamping a design. He was, by contemporary standards, one of the most qualified swordsmen the U.S. Army had access to. Two armies, on opposite sides of an ocean, arrived at the same design conclusion within 5 years of each other without copying one another's blueprint line for line. That is not coincidence. That is what happens when the same problem gets pushed to its logical end by two different countries running the same math: heavier rifles, denser volleys of fire, faster reload times, at the exact same moment in military history. More than 128,000 of these sabers were manufactured between 1913 and 1918 across two factories, one government arsenal and one civilian contractor. That is not a ceremonial number. That is the output of an army that expected to actually use these weapons at scale. Here is where the irony sharpens into something almost cruel. American cavalry units carrying Patton's saber were shipped to the front lines of the First World War within 4 years of the design entering service. They were held back almost immediately. A soldier on a horse holding the most refined thrusting sword ever built was not a threat to a machine gun crew. He was a target. The 1908 pattern did see the kind of combat it was built for, at least once. At Marui Wood in March of 1918, Lieutenant Gordon Flowerdew led a mounted charge of Lord Strathcona's horse straight into German machine gun positions, sabers drawn, the exact scenario the sword had been engineered around. The charge broke the German line. It also cost the squadron roughly 70% casualties in a matter of minutes. The sword worked exactly as designed. The battlefield it was designed for no longer existed anywhere else on the front. The cavalrymen who did see combat fought dismounted, using their horses only to move between positions, never for the mounted charge the Saber was designed around. German riflemen carrying Gewehr 98s and machine gun crews behind MG-08s made a mounted Saber charge across open ground close to a form of suicide. The most technically perfect cavalry weapon in history arrived at the exact moment cavalry itself stopped being viable. The United States Army did not officially retire the Saber from standard issue until 1934, more than 2 decades after Patton designed it, and roughly 2 decades after it had stopped mattering on any battlefield. Over 22,000 of them sat in inventory by then, many already marked unserviceable from age rather than combat, because most of them had never seen combat at all. The 1908 pattern never fully disappeared either. British, Canadian, and Australian cavalry regiments still carry it today, not as a weapon, as a ceremonial sword for parades and formal occasions. No new pattern has replaced it since. More than a century after adoption, the 1908 and 1912 designs remain, technically, the most recent regulation sword patterns the British Army has ever approved. A number of surviving Patton sabers did eventually see use in a Second World War, but not as swords. Soldiers cut the blades down into fighting knives, and intelligence operatives repurposed shortened versions as OSS drop knives. The weapon, built for a full extension thrust on horseback, ended its working life reshaped into a close-quarters blade for men fighting in trenches and shadows, doing a job its original design never imagined. Within a decade of the Saber's retirement, the U.S. cavalry itself stopped existing as a horse-mounted branch, folded entirely into mechanized and armored formations built around tanks and trucks. The transition Patton lived through personally was not incremental. It was the complete replacement of an entire branch of the military inside one career. There is a detail here that closes the loop better than any historian could plan it. The man who designed the last American cavalry sword spent the rest of his career proving that swords were finished. George Patton became one of the most famous tank commanders in American military history. The officer who engineered the most perfect thrusting blade ever issued to a cavalryman is remembered instead for leading armored divisions through a kind of warfare that made the sword permanently irrelevant. That is the part the story of the last sword keeps getting told backwards. It was not replaced because it failed. 2 committees, working years apart on opposite sides of an ocean, finally built the sword that solved every problem swords had carried for centuries and delivered it directly into a war that no longer had any use for swords at all.